There we go. Okay, right. So our hosts for today, or our presenters for today, sorry, are Andre Parsons and Patrick Conaway. Thank you very much. Off you go.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
So first of all, thank you for coming to our session. As Jackie kindly mentioned, I'm Pat Conaway. This is Andre. And
And today we'll be looking at extensive reading and reading targets and the rationale behind teachers' choices for their targets. So here is the outline for our presentation today. So we're going to begin with a short background to the study, followed by the research method, present our findings, followed by limitations and future directions. And please note that we will be having a Q&A, but it will be following our presentation. So if you are interested in talking to us more, please join us in the breakout room.
If you want, you can put your questions in the chat. I'll copy and bring those to the breakout room so that we can go through those together if you like. You don't have to keep those questions in your head.
Okay, so I think most of you are already aware that there's an abundance of ER literature. And while a lot of the extensive reading literature focuses on implementation, the kinds of ER and evaluation, when Pat and I looked more closely at the literature, we noticed that apart from a very, very small number of studies, there wasn't a lot of discussion about the rationale behind the targets and their styles of evaluation. So we thought that this could be a very important topic for research. So for this current study, we decided to use a survey that included both closed and open response items. And then we, after piloting the survey, we then first sent out an invitation to the GELT ERSIG membership, as well as the ER Facebook group. And then after collecting our data, we then selected the data for analysis based on two criteria. So A, control over implementation, so whether they had control over the type of ER they did and their style of grading, and B, whether they were teaching in Japan at the time. And then once we had that data selected, we then analyzed it thematically following the description put forth by Braun and Clark.
Now, our presentation is mainly focused on the why, but I can imagine that a lot of people here are also interested in the what and the how. So some of our closed answer or closed responses were for what type of assignments were given. We don't want to say what the average was, give kind of a normative response. We just want to tell you what types of assignments were out there. So if you're looking at what types of assignments, what type of measurement, some people counted how many books. There were also teachers that counted how many words. And some counted how much reading time students put in. Another difference that you could see in assignments was in how long the assignments were. Some teachers chose week-long assignments. Some went with, say, 7 weeks or a quarter, or others with a semester of 15 weeks. We didn't see anybody going into things longer than a semester, like 1 year or 2 years. They might have that type of program, but they usually broke it up into chunks of semesters at the longest. And for how much reading was done, on the low end, you could see some teachers looking at 50,000 words in a semester, so about 15 weeks. Whereas on the high end, there was about 180,000, sometimes 200,000 for a requirement. Now that usually differed based on the major. So students who were in science, technology, engineering, mathematics, they usually had lower requirements. And as you can imagine, English majors had much higher ones. This brings us to the main part of our presentation, the why, the rationale. So Andre and I went through the open-ended responses from our participants and started cutting those responses up into small chunks of meaning and labeling those with what we thought the themes were for those particular responses. Now, Andre and I, in order to not influence each other when we were first starting this, did that independently. Then we started to discuss and get a little bit more depth. In the center here, you can see kind of a word cloud of the different codes that came out. Things that are larger came up a little bit more often, and things that are smaller here came up 1 or 2 times, but not so much. But while we were discussing in our weekly meetings, we started to uncover different themes. So like the influence of the teaching context. When the teachers were focused on making some kind of change within the learners. Teachers who were talking about their experiences and how they were changing their teaching practice. Relationships with Dan Bamford's 10 principles. And the impact of kind of social interactions. So we're going to go into these one by one. So first, the learner-oriented theme. So 2 things that kind of cropped up when we're looking at responses is that teachers started to, or not everybody, but some of them were really interested in getting their learners to read more regularly. So not just quantity, but also consistency. So this is shown clearly by this quote. By grading on weekly benchmarks, I promote both volume and consistency. So not just reading a lot. We also saw teachers talking about extrinsic motivation. So needing to motivate their students to do the reading. So if we do not assign marks, most students do not do it. If we only assign 10% of the grade to ER, students see that it's not worth the time. Now, that being said, it seems that this extrinsic motivation is somewhat in a positive light. Many times when we hear teachers talk about motivation and say, my students are unmotivated, they have low motivation, they don't like to do this. We didn't see that in the results. We saw that there was a need for extrinsic motivation, but we didn't see much kind of complaining about low motivation. Now, Andre is going to talk about the practice.
Yes, so our second theme, of course, is a practice-oriented theme. And what this encompasses is actually experimentation and experience. And of course, these two are very much interrelated. So of course, in experimentation, what we're seeing here is that various practitioners are trying different things out in terms of their grading to see what works and what doesn't. As you can see here with this quote, this is the first year I've been teaching ER as a full course. So I am seeing how some students test the system to read as little as possible and to see where students may need more support. And of course, the other component here is experience, which again is related to experimentation. And here we have a very good quote about the process of the experience. So currently I have book discussions set to 20% of the total grade for the ER course, but this lets some students pass with less reading. So I'm thinking about changing this next year so that it is not required. So what we're seeing here, of course, this practitioner currently has 20% set for book discussions, but he or she is realizing that this is not working as well as he or she had hoped. So of course, now in future classes, they're going to try a different way of evaluation. So of course, now we're leading into the experiments and experimentation aspect of the practice of their ER grading. And the third theme, of course, is the socially oriented theme, or the human influence. And in particular, of course, we're looking at the influence of colleagues. And not just colleagues within your immediate teaching context, but of course in the wider ER circle or ER community of practice. So for the first quote here, we have, word goals were kept from my predecessor as they were based on extensive research he did in the area and match what I've seen in similar research. So of course, from this quote, we can also see that not only is there an influence from the colleague, but there's also like a level of trust in this more experienced colleague, and that his or her, sorry, in this case, his way of evaluation is actually working. So this person has decided to continue in that way. And for the second quote, of course, we're looking at the wider ER circle. Also, I have been influenced by conference presentations and discussions at ER-based events such as the JAL ER6 seminars and the ERWCO Extensive Reading World Congress. So of course, in addition to interacting with people like on site, you're also looking at going out to conferences and learning various methods through those discussions, through those opportunities on the conference circuit. And of course, to expand on that, in the last couple of years where things have gone more online, we now have more opportunities to do those exchanges.
Now, before we contacted our participants, Andre and I both kind of thought that research articles might figure more prominently in responses. We kind of expected this particular research article really influenced me to do my grading this way. And surprisingly, it didn't come to the forefront that much. So it seemed like these kind of human interactions were at least more in the front of the thinking of our respondents rather than things that they read. Oh, another thing that came up, and as you can probably imagine, is the influence of context on grading. Now, there are two big contextual things that came up. One is COVID-19. It made a huge difference in how people can and did go through their ER last year. So adapting to that emergency remote teaching. As this person wrote, pre-COVID, we used paper graded readers and Moodle Reader with a simple end of semester word count target. During COVID, we used X reading with 5 3-week blocks of time that have itemized percentages for the total reading grade. So COVID made a big change in this person's grading procedure. And this person goes on further afterwards that he's really interested in seeing how that change influences student reading behavior. So that ties in with the experimentation as well. Now, these are some of the easily imagined contextual influences. One is class size. So we found that people in classes of more than 10 students used quizzes a lot in order to determine did students do the reading. In classes that were much smaller, so fewer than 10, quizzes were hardly ever used, and it was more common to use self-report or one-on-one conferences with students. So that can really, just how many students you have to deal with can influence the tools. Now, this person here mentioned that. So MReader is a convenient and efficient tool for checking students are reading at appropriate levels. There are, of course, deficiencies of this tool, but it's efficient when checking the quantity of English read by so many students. So many of the people using quizzes didn't see it as an ideal measurement of reading. They just saw it as a way to handle lots of students. The other is school type. As this person wrote, there are no grades in Eikaiwa schools. That's an English conversation school. So I don't have the pressure to assess. I do keep casual track of what the students are reading. So for people in university settings, there's pressure from the Ministry of Education to give grades in a certain way. So we may be different from those in a more free kind of environment. And lastly, the principles that have had an influence.
Okay, so first I'm talking to you. So yes, again, when we relooked at the, could you put the next slide, Pat? All right, thank you. So, yeah, so again, looking at the data, we did see some, some of the principles up here. And of course, whether the practitioners were making these choices in alignment with the principles or whether the principles actually influence their choices, we do need like more, we need to follow up on that. But of course, the three principles that we did see from the data was reading a lot, reading for pleasure, and teacher support. And of course, reading a lot, of course, I think all of us will agree that is one of the fundamental components of extensive reading, as echoed by this comment here. It reflects the fundamental goal, which is reading as much as possible. And of course, looking at the word targets and the book targets, we can see that. And for reading for pleasure, of course, at the university level, ideally, we would have our students reading simply for pleasure, for enjoyment. But of course, we have to give grades, whereas in the conversation schools, they do not have to have that pressure. So of course, they can focus more on the enjoyment, as we can see in this quote. My way of using ER comes from a mixture of trial and error, and also believing the idea of extensive reading should be something that promotes reading for enjoyment rather than reading for assessment. And of course, here we also see another example of how various themes overlap and mix with each other, with the trial and error being the experience and experimentation. And finally, of course, teacher support. So I can focus on helping students select books better, and develop reading routines using word counts. So of course, again, using mReader Next Reading, for some people, it might not be ideal, but it does free them up to give one-on-one support better and more effectively.
Yeah, with that kind of use of quizzes, as Andre said, being freed up, it can focus on supporting students to help them read more, but also by kind of one-on-one interaction with students, it can free up the teacher to help the students maybe read for more pleasure. So the quizzes are not always as cold as they can be seen as. Okay, so we're coming to the end of our presentation, and some takeaways that we have is the top 10 principles for teaching extensive reading by Day and Bamford. We can use that as a framework for reflection. So when you're making your own policies for grading or for setting assignments, you can go through kind of principle by principle and say, how could this affect my students reading a lot? Or how could this affect my ability to orientate the students? So it's really easy to kind of go in a circle when you're just thinking about yourself. But if you have a framework like this, it can let you a little bit more efficiently look at your own thinking and maybe more deeply make choices about your policy. Next is, if you're new, if you're looking for advice, it's really common to ask people that are very experienced, but their advice is not always that useful or tailored to our own personal context. So try to get the story that's behind that person's choices. So instead of just, what did you do? Why did you do it? Maybe ask things like, well, what did you do before that? How was it before? Why did you want to change? Those additional questions can make a much more rich picture, and that in turn can help you apply that advice to your own context a little bit better, I think. And lastly, the need for places to share experiences informally. So we meet each other at conferences once or twice a year, and ER practitioners are very seldom in the same space. We're kind of spread out. So it's really difficult for us to have that daily conversation and sharing of experiences. So later on this evening, there's something called Loungers, which is the ER SIG's monthly informal chat. We're trying to build a space where people can have that type of interaction. So please drop by later on tonight.
Okay, and just to, again, one more slide here and then we're done. And of course, the limitations and future directions for our current study. So of course, we based our analysis on the open-ended survey responses. So of course, to get a deeper understanding, a richer understanding of the rationales, we're going to need to follow up the data with the survey with interviews. And of course, we'd like to also just send an invitation to everyone here at ERA this time. Of course, if you are interested in taking part in our study, please contact us. And of course, we do have a link to the survey in our presentation here today. And of course, another thing is most of the participants were at the university level. So of course, future research should focus more on high schools and junior highs and conversation schools as well. And again, most of the participants were native English ER practitioners. So of course, more representation of Japanese ER practitioners could also give us more insights into the rationale. All for our study today. So thank you very much.
So we're going to paste this into Edzilla later. So if you're interested, you can get this link